The most terrifying sound in the history of the Great Lakes wasn't a scream. It wasn't a desperate mayday call. It was a calm, steady baritone voice over a crackling radio saying 4 simple words: "We are holding our own." 10 minutes later, the radar screen was empty. She was called the Queen of the Lakes, a cathedral of American steel, built during an era of absolute industrial confidence. She was massive, she was beautiful, and she was supposed to be invincible. But Lake Superior is an ancient beast that doesn't care about our engineering, our schedules, or our pride. And when the Queen met the beast on a freezing November night in 1975, the battle lasted less than a minute. Forget the simple myths and the ghost stories you think you know. Today, we are going beyond the famous song. We are going back to that bridge as the snow blinds the windows to understand the mechanics of a disaster that defied belief. This isn't just a story about a shipwreck. It is a story about systems trusted implicitly until the very moment the world fell away. So settle in, turn down the lights, and join me as we descend 500 feet into the cold darkness to confront the truth behind the legend. We are holding our own. 4 words spoken over a crackling VHF radio channel. The voice is steady. It is baritone, calm, and utterly devoid of panic. It is the voice of a man ordering coffee at a diner he has visited 1,000 times. There is no tremor. There is no background noise of shouting crewmen, no screaming klaxons, no groaning of metal screeching against its own rivets. There is just the static hiss of the November air over Lake Superior. And that voice: "We are holding our own." It is the most famous sentence ever spoken on the Great Lakes. It is famous not for what it said, but for what it preceded. 10 minutes after those calm words traveled through the freezing air to a nearby ship, the radar blip that carried that voice simply vanished. There was no final cry, no mayday, just a professional assessment of a difficult evening, followed by absolute, terrifying silence. To understand the silence, you must first understand the voice. In the maritime world of the North American interior, calm is not a personality trait. It is a tool. It is engineered into captains just as surely as the steel is tempered for the hull. When the horizon turns black and the lake begins to stand up on its hind legs, panic is a luxury the bridge cannot afford. You speak plainly, you give coordinates, you report wind speed, you assess the list. You do not scream. But if you listen closely to the recording, or if you read the transcript knowing what we know now, that calm voice is the most unsettling sound in the world. Because when Captain Ernest McSorley spoke those words, his ship was already dying. He was standing on a bridge that was losing a war against gravity and water, and he was talking about it like a minor inconvenience. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald is usually told as a ghost story. It is presented as a mystery of the deep, a victim of a mythical curse that haunts the greatest of the lakes. But it is not a ghost story. It is an industrial tragedy. It is a story about a machine built with supreme confidence, operated by men with supreme skill, encountering a set of physics it was never designed to survive. The horror is not in the supernatural. The horror is in the routine. Before it was a wreck at the bottom of the sea, the Edmund Fitzgerald was a cathedral of American industrial might. Go back to 1957, to the shipyards of River Rouge, Michigan. The air is thick with the smell of ozone and burning metal. It is a time of absolute confidence. The war is over, the economy is booming, and the steel mills of Ohio and Pennsylvania are screaming for iron ore. They need more of it, and they need it faster. The Great Lakes are the highway for that iron. For decades, the ships that ran this route were smaller, manageable things, but the 50s demanded scale. The engineering wisdom of the day declared that bigger was better, bigger was faster, bigger was more profitable. And most dangerously, the belief took hold that bigger was safer. A larger hull, the thinking went, could shoulder aside heavier seas, so they built a giant. When the keel was laid, it stretched farther than any eye could comfortably take in. As the hull rose plate by riveted plate, it blocked out the sun over the shipyard. The Great Lakes Engineering Works had never attempted anything of this magnitude. When she was finally christened in the summer of 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald was the largest object ever launched into fresh water. She was magnificent, 729 feet long. To walk from the bow to the stern was a journey, A man could get lost in her cargo holds. She was 75 feet wide and 39 feet deep. She was designed to carry 26,000 tons of cargo at 16 miles per hour. She was a city of steel, built for the sole purpose of moving mountains of earth from Duluth to Detroit. She was dubbed the Queen of the Lakes. It was a title spoken with reverence. Captains on other vessels would alter their course just to get a look at her steaming by on a clear day. Her long, sleek deck gleaming in the sun, her massive propeller churning the blue water white. She was fast, she was beautiful, and she was exceptionally profitable. For 17 years she did exactly what she was built to do. She set records. She broke her own records. She became the benchmark against which all other Lakers were measured. But in the architecture of her greatness, there were quiet compromises. To make a ship that long, you have to understand how steel behaves on water. A ship is not a rigid brick. It is a girder. When a wave lifts the bow and another wave lifts the stern, the middle of the ship sags. When a massive wave lifts the center of the ship, the bow and stern hang in the air, causing the deck to hog upward. The Fitzgerald was designed to bend. She had to. If she were perfectly rigid, the first autumn gale would snap her in two. She was built to flex, to ride the energy of the lake rather than fight it entirely. This flexing was normal. It was part of the daily sensation of being aboard. Crewmen in the tunnels below deck could sometimes see the distant end of the passageway moving relative to where they stood. As the years went on, the ore carriers got even bigger. The 1,000-footers arrived, dwarfing even the mighty Fitz. But the Fitzgerald remained the sentimental favorite. She was the elegant elder statesman of the fleet. Yet every season she sailed, every storm she weathered, the metal was working, flexing, stretching, relaxing. It is the slow, invisible fatigue of giants. The ship was built to win the lakes, and for almost 2 decades it seemed she had. But the lakes play a long game. By November of 1975, the Fitzgerald was no longer the new recruit. She was a veteran workhorse, showing signs of age. There was rust running in streaks down the white paint of the pilot house. The engines, while powerful, had countless thousands of hours on them, and the man commanding her was much the same. Captain Ernest McSorley was 63 years old. He was a quiet man, a heavy smoker, known for keeping his own counsel. He was not the type of captain who told tall tales in waterfront bars. He was a company man, respected for his efficiency and his unflappable nature. He had spent 44 years on the water. He knew the mood swings of the lakes better than he knew his own backyard. This was supposed to be his final season. He had told friends that he was tired. The endless cycle of loading, steaming, unloading and steaming back empty was wearing him down. The vibration of the engines in his cabin, the smell of taconite dust, the cold damp of the autumn crossings, it was enough. He was looking forward to retirement, to sleeping through a night without checking a barometer. There is a particular danger that comes at the end of a long career of managing risk. When you have done something dangerous 1,000 times without consequence, the danger ceases to feel real. Experience, which should make you cautious, can sometimes act as an anesthetic. You begin to trust the machine implicitly. You begin to believe that because the worst has never happened, it never will. McSorley was known as a heavy weather captain. This wasn't an insult. In the shipping industry, it was high praise. It meant he didn't hide in port every time the wind blew. He knew exactly how much his ship could take, and he pushed her right up to that line to keep the schedule. The steel mills didn't care about the weather. They cared about tonnage. McSorley delivered. On that final run, he wasn't being reckless. He was just being Ernest McSorley. He was doing what he had always done, relying on the accumulated wisdom of 4 decades to tell him when the lake was bluffing and when it was serious. He trusted the Fitzgerald. They had grown old together. He knew her groans, her shudders, and the specific way she handled a following sea. He believed that if he treated her right, she would bring him home one last time. But the North American continent has a unique meteorological feature that doesn't care about captains' retirement plans. It is November on the Great Lakes. To understand what happened, you have to stop thinking of the Great Lakes as lakes. They are freshwater oceans. Superior, the largest and deepest, is particularly violent. It holds enough water to flood North and South America to a depth of 1 foot. It is incredibly deep and unbelievably cold. In November, 2 massive atmospheric forces collide over this vast expanse of water. The freezing dry air plunges down from the Canadian Arctic, heavy and dense. At the same time, warm, moist air is pulled up from the Gulf of Mexico. Where these 2 air masses meet, they declare war. The result is a low-pressure system of terrifying intensity. It is a cyclone, often called a gales of November witch. The atmospheric pressure drops so rapidly that it acts like a vacuum cleaner, sucking air in from all sides to fill the void. The winds whip around the center of the low, building in speed and ferocity. On the open ocean, waves generated by a storm like this can travel for hundreds of miles, organizing themselves into long, rolling swells. A ship can ride up one side and slide down the other. But Lake Superior is a bowl. It is surrounded by rocky shorelines. The winds push the water across the surface, building waves higher and steep. When these waves hit the far shore, they bounce back, colliding with the incoming waves. The result is a chaotic, confused sea. The waves don't just roll, they crash into each other, creating massive pyramidal peaks of water that have no rhythm or predictability. They are steep-faced walls of green water that hit a ship like a solid hammer blow. And because fresh water is less dense than salt water, the waves are sharper, chopping at the hull with a higher frequency. A November gale on Superior doesn't just batter a ship, it tortures it. It twists the hull, subjecting it to complex torque forces that designers in the 1950s couldn't fully calculate with slide rules. The lake becomes a washing machine filled with mountains of ice-cold water. The forecast for early November 1975 began to show the classic signs of one of these monsters forming over the plains. It was moving toward the lakes. The meteorologists saw the pressure dropping. They issued gale warnings, then upgraded them to storm warnings. But warnings in November are like snow in January. They are part of the landscape. The captains of the big ore carriers saw the forecast, noted it in their logs and kept loading. On November 8th, the Edmund Fitzgerald arrived at the Burlington Northern Railroad Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin. The weather was gray and cold, typical for the season. The ship was tied off, and the massive chutes were lowered over the open cargo hatches along the deck. For hours, the sound of the loading dominated the harbor. It is a deafening roar, thousands of tons of cargo pouring into the steel belly of the ship. The cargo was taconite. Taconite is the lifeblood of the steel industry, but it is also a miserable cargo to haul. In its natural state, it is a low-grade iron ore encased in hard rock. To make it useful, the rock is crushed into powder. The iron is magnetically separated, and then it is rolled into small, marble-sized pellets mixed with clay binder. These pellets are baked until they are hard as flint. They look harmless enough, little reddish-black balls you could hold in the palm of your hand. But en masse, they are incredibly heavy. They are dense. A cubic foot of taconite pellets weighs far more than a cubic foot of water, or grain, or coal. When you load taconite, you are putting an immense, concentrated weight into the bottom of the ship. The Fitzgerald was designed to carry this weight, but it left very little margin for error. When fully loaded, the massive 75-foot deep hull sat so low in the water that only a few feet of steel, the freeboard, remained above the surface line. The deck was almost level with the lake. There is another property of taconite that every sailor knows, something that sits in the back of their minds whenever the hatches are clamped down. Taconite is porous. If water gets into the cargo holds, the pellets don't dissolve. They don't wash away. They just get heavier. They soak up the water like sponges made of stone. A flooded hold filled with grain might swell and burst the hatches, but a flooded hold filled with taconite just becomes an anchor. The water snakes down through the gaps between the marbles, adding thousands of tons of weight that the pumps cannot easily remove because the water is trapped deep within the cargo pile. If enough water gets in, the ship doesn't capsize. It doesn't roll over dramatically, it simply loses its buoyancy. It gets lower and lower in the water until the lake simply steps onto the deck and never steps off. On the afternoon of November 9th, 26,116 tons of these little iron marbles were inside the Fitzgerald. It was a heavy load, but within the legal limits. The hatch covers were rolled into place. They were massive single pieces of steel, designed to create a watertight seal over the holds. Crewmen walked the deck, tightening the dozens of manual clamps around the perimeter of each hatch. It was back-breaking, tedious work, knocking the clamps tight with heavy sledgehammers, ensuring the gaskets were compressed. The integrity of the entire ship depended on those clamps holding tight. By 2:00 p.m., the loading was complete. The ship was buttoned up. In the engine room, the massive steam turbines were brought up to temperature. The vibration began, a low-frequency thrum that traveled up through the decks, rattling coffee cups in the galley and vibrating through the soles of the crewmen's boots. It was the heartbeat of the ship, a comforting, powerful sound that meant everything was working. Captain McSorley was on the bridge. He reviewed the latest weather forecast. The low-pressure system was tracking near Marquette. It was going to be a nasty trip, blowing 40 to 50 knots, with waves up to 15 feet. It was nothing the Fitzgerald hadn't seen 50 times before. It was just November. Another ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, under the command of Captain Bernie Cooper, was departing nearby at roughly the same time. The two captains spoke over the radio. They agreed to take the northern route across the lake, hugging the Canadian shore. It was a longer path, but it offered some protection from the northerly winds that were predicted to intensify overnight. It was a sound strategy, a prudent decision made by two experienced shipmasters. At 2:15 p.m. on November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald cast off her lines. The thick manila ropes were pulled aboard, dripping with cold harbor water. The propeller turned, churning the silty water of the slip. Slowly, majestically, the Queen of the Lakes backed away from the dock, turned her bow toward the open water, and began her journey toward Detroit. Standing on the shore, watching her go, she looked invincible, a long black sliver of American industrial might against the gray sky. Smoke poured from her stack, trailing behind her as she picked up speed. The crew went about their regular watches. The cooks began preparing dinner in the galley. In the crew mess, a card game likely started up. It was the definition of a routine departure. There were no omens, no strange feelings, just 29 men doing a job they knew by heart, on a machine they trusted implicitly, heading out into a lake they respected, but did not fear. As the shoreline of Wisconsin faded into the gray mist behind them, the Fitzgerald was doing exactly what she was built to do. She was carrying iron. She was making money. She was winning the lake. No one on board could know that the atmospheric bomb was already detonating over the plains, and that this routine voyage was about to become the ultimate test of steel against water. The calm voice on the radio was still 24 hours away. For now, there was just the thrum of the engines and the open, waiting water of Lake Superior. The transition from a routine autumn voyage to a fight for survival on the Great Lakes is rarely instant. It is a slow creep, a gradual tightening of the screws. As darkness fell on the evening of November 9th, the Edmund Fitzgerald steamed rapidly across the western half of Lake Superior. Inside the crew quarters, the atmosphere was warm and bright. The smell of roast beef from dinner lingered in the galley. The sounds of the storm outside, the rising wind, the slap of spray against the hull, were muffled by inches of steel plating and insulation. There is a profound psychological comfort in being aboard a massive ship during bad weather. It feels like a floating fortress, a man-made island that has conquered the elements. The crew of the Fitzgerald trusted their ship implicitly. They knew she had been through worse than what the forecast was currently showing. They trusted the rivets, the welds, and the sheer mass of the vessel to shrug off the lake's anger. When you are inside that much steel, the storm feels abstract. You see the barometric pressure falling on the instrument panel. You hear the wind howling past the bridge wings, but your coffee cup is sitting still on the table. The lights are on. The engines are humming their steady, reassuring rhythm. The forecast was just paper. The ship was steel. And for the first night, the steel did its job. Throughout the night and into the morning of November 10th, the Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson, which was trailing about 10 to 15 miles behind, hugged the Canadian shore. They were hiding behind the landmass, using it as a shield against the northeast winds that were building across the open water. It was a standard heavy weather tactic. Captain McSorley on the Fitzgerald and Captain Cooper on the Anderson talked frequently on the radio. Their conversations were relaxed, professional exchanges about weather patterns and navigation. They were two veterans playing a zone defense against the lake. But weather systems are dynamic living things. As the morning progressed, the massive low-pressure center moved. It didn't just move. It deepened, spinning faster and faster, pulling the winds around the compass dial. The wind shifted from northeast to east, then to southeast. This shift was critical. As long as the wind was coming from the north, the Canadian shore protected them. But as the wind swung around to come from the south and east, that protection evaporated. The ships were suddenly exposed to the full fetch of the lake, the distance the wind blows over open water to build waves. By early afternoon on November 10th, the wind was screaming at over 50 miles per hour. The waves, which had been an uncomfortable chop, began to grow into moving hills. They were 15, then 20 feet high. The two captains made a decision. They would leave the fading protection of the Canadian shore and make a break for Whitefish Point. Whitefish Point is the gateway to the St. Mary's River, the sheltered canal system that leads down to Lake Huron. It was the finish line. If they could round the point, the lake's fury would be blocked by the land, and they would be safe. It was a calculated risk. Enter the open cauldron of the eastern lake for a few hours to reach final safety. There is a false sense of security that comes from sailing in a convoy. Seeing another ship nearby, watching its lights rise and fall in the distance, makes the situation feel manageable. If they are handling it, you feel you can handle it too. The Anderson, trailing behind, used the Fitzgerald as a visual guide, following her radar blip through the blinding snow and spray. But proximity is not protection. The lake treats every hull as an individual physics problem. The waves hitting the Fitzgerald were not the same waves hitting the Anderson 10 miles back. Each ship was fighting its own solitary war against buoyancy. Sometime in the mid-afternoon, the war changed. The exact moment is lost, but the wind shifted again, swinging around to the northwest. This is the worst-case scenario on Superior. A northwest wind blows across the entire length of the lake, building waves of terrifying size and steepness. Worse, this new wave train collided with the old waves coming from the southeast. The lake became chaotic. The orderly swells were replaced by confused, crashing pyramids of water. The Fitzgerald, fully loaded and sitting low, began to take heavy seas over her deck. Imagine standing on the roof of a 20-story building. Now imagine a wave of green water, solid and cold as concrete, crashing over that roof, burying everything in 6 feet of swirling foam before draining away, only to be followed by another and another every 10 seconds. That was the deck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The massive water rushed down the long spar deck, smashing against the hatches, tearing at anything not welded down. It slammed into the forward superstructure, shaking the pilot house. At 3:30 p.m., the calm routine was broken. Captain McSorley radioed Captain Cooper on the Anderson. His voice was not panicked, but it carried a new weight. He reported that the Fitzgerald had sustained topside damage. A fence railing on the deck had been smashed. A couple of vents, which allow air into the ballast tanks, had been sheared off. And most concerning, he said, "I have a list." A list. The ship was leaning to one side. McSorley told Cooper he was slowing down to let the Anderson catch up. He said he was turning on his pumps. When a captain turns on the main pumps in a storm, it is an admission that the sea has breached the defenses. The Fitzgerald was equipped with massive pumps located in the engine room stern. They were designed to move thousands of gallons of water a minute. They were powerful machines, capable of emptying the ballast tanks rapidly for loading and unloading. But these pumps were designed to move clean ballast water, or to handle the slow, inevitable weep of a rivet or a shaft seal. They were not designed to fight the Atlantic Ocean forcing its way inside. When the pumps were engaged, a new sound joined the symphony of the storm. Below decks, the high-pitched whine of electrical motors and the deep thrum of water rushing through pipes became constant. The crew in the engine room would have watched the gauges closely. They were looking for the water level in the bilges to drop, a sign that the pumps were winning. But if the water is coming in faster than it can be pushed out, the pumps just run and run, changing nothing. And then there was the list. A ship is designed to float level. When it leans to port or starboard and stays there, it means the center of gravity has shifted. Something heavy, water, is pooling on one side. A list is insidious. It changes everything about how the ship handles. When a wave hits a listed ship, it doesn't roll back cleanly. It hangs there. The water on deck pools on the downhill side, adding more weight, making the list worse. It's a feedback loop. More dangerously, a list puts terrifying strain on the cargo. 26,000 tons of taconite pellets were sitting in the holds. If that cargo shifted, if those millions of marble-sized rocks tumbled toward the leaning side, the list would become permanent and catastrophic. The ship would never right itself. As afternoon turned to twilight, the situation on the Fitzgerald was deteriorating, but it was doing so quietly. There were no explosions. There was no sudden snap of the keel. There was just the relentless accumulation of water and the sickening, persistent lean of the deck. To anyone listening on the radio channel, however, it sounded like a difficult but manageable workday. The maritime culture of the Great Lakes, particularly among the older captains like McSorley, valued stoicism above almost everything else. You did not clutter the airwaves with emotion. You stated facts. At 4:10 p.m., the Fitzgerald radioed the Anderson again to report that both their radars had failed. The spinning antennas atop the pilot house had likely been whipped to death by the hurricane-force winds. A ship without radar in a blinding snowstorm is blind. McSorley asked the Anderson to keep track of them and provide navigational assistance. Captain Cooper agreed, closing the distance between the two ships to about 9 miles. The Anderson was now the eyes for both vessels. On Cooper's radar screen, the Fitzgerald was a bright green blip ahead of them, fighting its way toward Whitefish Point. Outside, the world had become a screaming void of grey and white. The sun had set early behind the storm clouds. The snow was blowing horizontally, stinging like sand. The waves were now officially monstrous, 25 feet high, with occasional rogues towering even higher. They were crashing over the back of the Anderson, burying the stern section where the engine room crew lived. Men later reported looking out portholes and seeing water above them, green and solid, before the ship shook itself free and rose again. If it was that bad on the Anderson, which was riding higher in the water, it is terrifying to imagine what it was like on the lower, heavier Fitzgerald ahead. The waves must have been rolling the entire length of her deck, submerging the hatches under millions of pounds of pressure every few seconds. Yet, the radio traffic remained professional. They talked about navigational waypoints. They talked about the beacon light at Whitefish Point, which had been knocked out by the storm. They were solving problems one by one. Why didn't McSorley call a mayday? Why didn't he sound the general alarm and order the crew to the lifeboats? Because in that moment, with the information he had, a mayday might have seemed premature. A mayday is a final act. It is a declaration that the ship is lost. Once you make that call, you are no longer trying to save the vessel. You are only trying to save the lives. And in those conditions, launching lifeboats was a suicide mission. To send men out into 30-foot waves and 80-mile-per-hour winds in small, open boats was to condemn them to death. As long as the steel hull of the Fitzgerald was still floating, it was the safest place on the lake. So they held on, they trusted the machine. They kept the pumps running. The wheelman fought the helm, trying to keep the bow pointed into the waves, trying to keep the list from getting worse. McSorley stood at the window, staring into the blinding snow, feeling the rhythm of his ship through his boots, calculating the distance to safety. They were only about 17 miles from Whitefish Point. An hour, maybe 2 of steaming, they were so close. At 7:10 p.m., a Swedish saltwater vessel, the Avafors, which was anchored near Whitefish Point, radioed the Fitzgerald. The pilot of the Avafors asked McSorley how they were making out in the storm. McSorley's reply was immediate. His voice was clear. There was no background noise of chaos, just the static of the atmosphere. He said, "We are holding our own." Those 5 words have echoed through history. They are often interpreted as a brave front, a captain refusing to show fear in the face of death. But they were likely something much more practical. In the language of an engineer, holding our own means that the situation has stabilized. It means the rate of water ingress matches the capacity of the pumps. It means the list is not getting worse. It means that while things are terrible, they are not currently terminal. It is a statement of calculated equilibrium. It was the assessment of a man who believed he was still in the fight. He had lost his radar. He had lost deck vents. He had a worrying list. The pumps were running flat out, but they were still moving forward. The engines were turning, the lights were on. "We are holding our own." It was the last transmission ever sent by the Edmund Fitzgerald. It is a chilling final testament because it reveals the ultimate danger of a slow-moving disaster. The crew didn't know they were in the last minutes of their lives. They thought they were in the middle of a long, hard night that they would eventually talk about over beers in a port bar. They were compartmentalizing the fear, focusing on their individual jobs, watching a gauge, holding a compass heading, listening to the rhythm of the pumps. They were professionals doing what they were trained to do, trusting that the system would hold together just long enough. But the equilibrium of holding our own is a fragile thing on Lake Superior. It is a razor's edge. All it takes is one variable to change, one wave slightly bigger than the rest, one piece of metal finally fatiguing past its limit, one more ton of water finding a way in, and the balance tips tragically, instantly, and irreversibly against you. As the Fitzgerald plowed ahead into the darkness and the snow, that balance was about to give way. The machine was reaching its limit. The reality of the lake was about to overwhelm the architecture of the ship. The silence was coming. We will never know the exact mechanics of the final minutes. The lake has kept those details for itself. There are theories, cargo shifts, bottoming out on a shoal, massive structural failure, but no one survived to tell us which one is true. What we do know is that the end, when it came, was not a slow decline. It was a collapse. Sometime around 7:15 p.m., the delicate equilibrium that Captain McSorley had described as holding our own completely disintegrated. Imagine the scene on the bridge. The snow is blinding, hammering against the thick glass windows. The only light is the dim red glow of the instrument panels. The ship is listing heavily to starboard, making it difficult to even stand upright without holding on to something. The roar of the wind outside is a constant, deafening scream. And then, something changes. The rhythm of the ship's struggle against the waves alters suddenly. Perhaps it was a sound. A deep, resonant boom that rose above the wind felt more than heard as a massive section of steel plating finally gave way deep in the hull. Or perhaps it was the sickening screech of metal tearing as a hatch cover, battered by thousands of tons of water for hours, finally collapsed inward, opening a massive highway for the lake to pour into the cargo hold. Or maybe it was just a feeling. The horrifying sensation of the bow plunging into a deep trough between two massive waves, burying itself in solid water, and then just not rising again. Instead of fighting its way back up to the surface, the nose of the great ship kept going down, heavy, sluggish, pulled by an irresistible weight. Whatever the trigger, the result was catastrophic. The pumps, which had been screaming for hours, lost their argument with the Atlantic Ocean. The inflow of water went from a manageable stream to a deluge. The taconite pellets, those millions of little iron sponges, would have been soaked instantly. The extra weight added in seconds would have been staggering. The list would have pitched wildly, throwing men off their feet, sending coffee cups, logbooks, and tools flying across the tilted decks. In the engine room at the stern, the crew would have felt the ship shudder violently. The angle of the deck would have become impossible. Perhaps the massive steam turbines, starved of oil due to the extreme angle, began to scream before tripping offline. The lights, powered by generators connected to those turbines, would have flickered, dimmed, and then gone out. Darkness. Absolute terrifying darkness, save for the occasional flashlight beam slicing through the steam and spray. In the pilot house, McSorley and his bridge crew would have known instantly that it was over. There was no time for a mayday. A mayday takes seconds to articulate. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the Edmund Fitzgerald. Our position is." Seconds they did not have. The ship was no longer sailing. It was falling. The bow was diving for the bottom, 500 feet down. The stern, still buoyant with air trapped in the engine room spaces, might have risen momentarily out of the water, the massive propeller spinning wildly in the snowy air before it too was dragged under. The entire event, from the moment the balance tipped to the moment the ship vanished beneath the surface, likely took less than a minute, perhaps 30 seconds. It was too fast for lifeboats, too fast for survival suits, too fast for anything but the chaotic, terrifying realization of the end. 10 miles behind them, on the bridge of the Arthur M. Anderson, Captain Bernie Cooper was staring at his radar screen. The snow was so thick he couldn't see past the bow of his own ship, but the radar was his eyes. For hours, the Fitzgerald had been a solid, bright green blip right ahead of them. Cooper had been talking to McSorley just minutes before. He had heard that calm voice. He looked away for a moment, perhaps to check a chart or to wipe condensation from the window. When he looked back at the radar screen, the blip was gone. He blinked. He adjusted the gain knob, thinking maybe the signal had just gotten weak in the clutter of the storm returns. He adjusted the range, scanning farther ahead. Nothing. The screen where the Edmund Fitzgerald should have been was empty blackness. A cold dread washed over him. Radar blips don't just disappear. Ships don't just vanish. He grabbed the radio microphone. His voice, usually as steady as McSorley's, was tight with anxiety. "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Have you checked down?" Silence. Just the hiss of static. "Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson, over." Nothing. Cooper called again and again. He called on the emergency channel. He called on the working channel. He tried every frequency they had used that day. The silence on the other end was heavier than the storm outside. It wasn't just a lack of response, it was an echoing void. It was the sound of a connection broken instantly and utterly. On the Anderson, the crew on the bridge went quiet. They all knew what a disappearing radar blip meant in these conditions. But the mind refuses to accept it. It's too fast. It makes no sense. They just talked to him. Cooper contacted the other ships in the area, the saltwater vessels anchored near Whitefish Point. Had anyone seen the Fitzgerald? Had anyone heard a mayday? No one had heard anything. The Avafor's pilot, the last person besides Cooper to speak to McSorley, confirmed that their last contact was routine. Holding our own. Cooper then made the most difficult call of his career. He radioed the United States Coast Guard station at Sault Ste. Marie. The radio man at the Coast Guard station sounded calm, almost bored. It was a busy night with the storm. Lots of minor issues were being reported. "Coast Guard, this is the Arthur M. Anderson," Cooper said, his voice trembling slightly now. "We have lost contact with the Edmund Fitzgerald. I think she's gone. I think she went down." There was a pause on the other end. The Coast Guard radio man seemed to have trouble processing the information. A 700-foot ore carrier didn't just go down without a word. "Say again, Anderson, you lost contact." "Yeah," Cooper said, the reality sinking in with every word. "I had him on radar. He was right ahead of me. I looked away for a minute, looked back, and he was gone. I've been trying to raise him on all channels, nothing, no mayday, nothing." The Coast Guard began to mobilize, but it was an agonizingly slow process in 1975. They had no helicopters capable of flying in that weather. Their rescue boats couldn't handle 30-foot waves. The only thing they could do was ask other commercial ships in the area, the very ships that had just barely survived the crossing themselves, to turn around and go back into the teeth of the storm to search. Captain Cooper didn't hesitate. He informed his crew that they were turning around. They were going back out. It was an act of supreme courage. The Anderson was battered. Her crew was exhausted. Turning a massive ship broadside to those waves to reverse course was incredibly dangerous. They could easily have rolled over themselves, but they did it. They turned the Anderson around and headed back into the black, howling maelstrom toward the last known position of the Fitzgerald. They were joined by another freighter, the William Clay Ford. Together, they grid-searched the area for hours, their searchlights cutting feeble cones of light into the driving snow. They were looking for lifeboats. They were looking for flares. They were looking for debris, crates, life rings, anything that would indicate a ship had broken up on the surface. They found nothing. The lake was empty. Just mountain after mountain of black water, capped with white foam, roaring under the screaming wind. The lack of debris was a chilling detail. When a ship breaks up slowly on the surface, it leaves a trail. Things float away. Oil slicks form. Wood splinters. The absence of debris suggested a clean, rapid sinking. It meant the Fitzgerald had gone down whole, or had broken up so violently and quickly that everything was sucked down with it instantly. It meant that whatever happened, happened fast. While the ships searched in vain on the dark lake, a different kind of ordeal was beginning ashore. The news traveled slowly at first, then with agonizing speed. In the company towns around the Great Lakes, in Superior, in Toledo, in Cleveland, phones began to ring in the middle of the night. Wives of crewmen, used to the worrying rhythms of a sailor's life, answered with sleep-clouded voices, a knot of dread already forming in their stomachs. The voice on the other end was usually a company official, struggling to keep his own voice steady. "There's been an incident," they would say. "We've lost contact with the Fitzgerald. We don't know anything for sure yet. The Coast Guard is searching." It was the beginning of the long wait, the maritime vigil. Families gathered in living rooms, staring at radios that offered no news, just weather reports of the continuing gale. They waited for the phone to ring again, praying for it to be good news, fearing it would be the final confirmation. They clung to hope. These were big ships. These were experienced men. Maybe the radio was just out. Maybe they were drifting. But as the hours ticked by, as night turned to a grey, storm-ravaged dawn, the hope began to thin. The Coast Guard launched an aircraft at first light. It flew low over the search area, battling turbulence, its crew scanning the churning water below. At around 8:00 a.m. on November 11th, the pilot of the aircraft radioed back a sighting. They saw an oil slick, and then they saw something else. Bobbing in the chaotic water, half submerged, was a life raft. It was orange, bright against the grey water. It was one of the Fitzgerald's inflatable rafts. The pilot circled, straining to see. Was there anyone inside? Was there a hand waving? The raft was empty. A short time later, they spotted a second raft, also empty. Also found were a few life preservers, some pieces of wood, a propane tank, the detritus of a lost ship. But no people, no bodies. The discovery of the empty rafts was the final, crushing blow. If the crew hadn't been able to get into the rafts, it meant they never had a chance. It meant the end had been instantaneous. Later that morning, the inevitable announcement was made. The Edmund Fitzgerald was lost with all hands. 29 men. The news sent a shockwave through the Great Lakes community. It was impossible to believe. The Fitzgerald, the Queen of the Lakes, gone. It was like hearing a mountain had simply fallen over. It defied the established order of things. In the company offices, the administrative machinery of death began to turn. Telegrams were drafted. Insurance forms were pulled from file cabinets. The process of turning 29 vibrant, living men into paperwork began. Names were typed onto lists. McSorley, Ernest M. McCarthy, John H. O'Brien, Eugene W. 29 names. Each one a life, a history, a family left behind. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, gone in a minute. As the storm finally began to blow itself out, leaving behind a bruised and sullen lake, the initial shock gave way to a profound and haunting silence. The kind of silence that settles over a community when something unspeakable has happened. There were no graves to visit, no bodies to bury, just the vast, cold expanse of Lake Superior, hiding its newest secret 530 feet down. The search for survivors ended, and the search for answers began. Why? How could this happen? The silence of the lake was replaced by a cacophony of questions. But the only witnesses who knew the truth were lying in the cold dark at the bottom of the inland sea, enshrined in the wreckage of the machine they had trusted until the very end. The loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald was not just a news story. It was a seismic event in the culture of the Great Lakes. It shattered the illusion of technological invincibility that had built up over decades of industrial progress. If the biggest, strongest ship could simply vanish without a trace, what was safe? For months, the lake kept its secret. The winter sealed the surface with ice, making any underwater investigation impossible. The families waited. The shipping industry waited. The mystery deepened, fed by the silence. It wasn't until the following summer, in May of 1976, that technology caught up with the tragedy. The U.S. Navy brought in a high-tech underwater recovery vehicle, a remotely operated camera sled called the Curve 3. They knew roughly where the ship had gone down, based on the last radar position from the Anderson. The Curver 3 was lowered over the side of a support ship, its powerful floodlight slicing through the eternal darkness of the deep lake, 530 feet down. The water temperature is a constant 39 degrees Fahrenheit. The pressure is immense. It is a world of perpetual night, inhabited only by strange pale fish that have never seen the sun. Slowly, the camera sled was towed across the silt-covered bottom. The operators on the surface stared at grainy black and white monitors, watching the lake bed scroll by. Mud, rocks, more mud. And then, something man-made loomed out of the gloom. It was a wall of steel, rivets, plating covered in a thin layer of silt. They moved the camera up, and there it was. The name, painted in bold white letters on the stern, still perfectly legible despite the trauma of the sinking. Edmund Fitzgerald. She was found. But what they saw on those monitors only deepened the mystery. The ship was not in one piece. She was broken in two. The massive bow section, nearly 300 feet long, was sitting upright on the bottom as if it was still sailing. The elegant curve of the prow, the anchor pockets, the forward pilot house where Captain McSorley had stood, it was all there, eerily intact. But the rest of the ship was gone. They moved the camera sled further, searching the darkness. About 170 feet away, they found the rest of her. The stern section, including the engine room and crew quarters, was lying upside down. It was a mangled wreck of twisted steel, propeller shaft, and rudder pointing toward the surface. Between the two main sections lay a vast debris field of taconite pellets, spilled cargo hatch covers, and crumpled hull plating. The entire midsection of the ship, a stretch of nearly 200 feet, had simply disintegrated. The break pattern was violent. It wasn't a clean snap. The metal was torn, twisted, and bent in ways that suggested unimaginable forces. The footage from the seafloor was analyzed by naval architects, engineers, and investigators. They built models. They ran computer simulations. And the debate began. A debate that continues to this day. How did it happen? Theory number 1. The hatch covers failed. This was the conclusion of the official Coast Guard investigation. They argued that the clamps holding the massive steel covers over the cargo holds were not tight enough, or that some had broken in the storm. As the waves repeatedly crashed over the deck, water was forced past the seals, gradually filling the cargo holds. The taconite soaked up the water. The ship got heavier and lower, and finally, it lost its buoyancy and plunged to the bottom, breaking apart as it hit the lake bed. It's a plausible theory. It fits the timeline of a slow accumulating problem. It explains the list. But many experienced sailors, including Captain Cooper of the Anderson, disagreed vehemently. They argued that the crew of the Fitzgerald were professionals. They wouldn't have left hatches unsecured. And even if a few clamps failed, it wouldn't have let in water fast enough to sink the ship so suddenly. Theory number 2. She bottomed out. This was Cooper's theory. He believed that the Fitzgerald, in the blinding snow, had unknowingly passed over a shoal area near Caribou Island known as the 6-fathom shoal. In the trough of a massive wave, with the ship already riding low from its heavy load, the hull might have scraped against the rocky bottom. A scrape wouldn't necessarily tear a hole, but it could have buckled the hull plates, cracking welds and seams. This would have started a slow, uncontrollable leak in the bottom of the ship, a much more insidious problem than topside damage. The water would have been coming in from below, where the pumps were less effective. The damage McSorley reported, the vents, the railing, might have happened at the same time as the bottoming out, a violent shudder that shook things loose on deck. Theory number 3. Structural failure. The ship was 17 years old. She had spent her life bending and flexing in the lakes. Had the metal finally had enough? Some argued that the midsection of the hull, weakened by years of fatigue, simply gave way under the chaotic stress of the storm. Perhaps she was suspended between two massive waves at the bow and stern, leaving the middle unsupported, and her own weight snapped her back. Or perhaps a massive wave amidships pushed the center down while the ends were supported, breaking her keel. If the hull snapped in the middle, the ship would have folded like a hinge and gone down in seconds. This fits the sudden disappearance from radar and the lack of a mayday call. Theory number 4. The rogue wave. The Anderson reported being hit by two massive rogue waves from astern just minutes before the Fitzgerald vanished. These waves were larger than anything else they saw that night, perhaps 35 feet high, moving faster than the rest of the sea. If these waves overtook the Anderson and then hit the slower-moving Fitzgerald, they could have been the killing blow. The first wave might have lifted the stern high in the air, driving the bow deep into the water. Before the bow could recover, the second wave would have crashed down on top of it, burying it under thousands of tons of water and pushing it straight to the bottom. The ship would have been driven underwater like a submarine, but it wasn't built to be a submarine. The pressure would have crushed the cargo hatches inward, and the lake would have poured in, instantly sealing her fate. Which theory is correct? The frustrating, terrifying truth is that they might all be partially correct. A disaster is rarely the result of a single failure. It is almost always a chain of events, a conspiracy of small things that add up to a catastrophe. Perhaps the ship did scrape bottom, starting a slow leak. Perhaps the hatch clamps were working loose in the storm. Perhaps the metal was fatigued. And then perhaps those rogue waves arrived at the exact moment when the ship's defenses were at their weakest. The leak from below, the water from above, the structural weakness, and the hammer blow of the waves. It all converged in one horrifying minute in the dark. The Coast Guard report, released years later, officially blamed ineffective hatch closures. The shipping industry and the families of the crew largely rejected this, feeling it blamed the dead men for their own demise. They preferred the theory of the shoal or the rogue wave, acts of God that no sailor could have prevented. The truth lies somewhere in the cold silt between the two broken halves of the ship. The lake knows, but it isn't talking. In the wake of the disaster, as is always the case, rules were changed. Safety regulations are almost always written in blood. The Coast Guard mandated improvements in cargo hold watertightness. Ships were required to carry survival suits, insulated full-body suits that could keep a man alive in freezing water for hours. Giving rescuers a chance, better depth finders and GPS navigation systems became standard. The industry learned. The ships became safer. But the lesson was bought at an unimaginable price. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald might have faded into history, becoming just another entry in the long, sad ledger of Great Lakes shipwrecks, known only to maritime enthusiasts and historians. But in 1976, a Canadian folk singer named Gordon Lightfoot read a small article in Newsweek magazine about the sinking. The story grabbed him: the image of the big ship, the seasoned crew, the terrible storm, the sudden silence. He sat down and wrote a song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It wasn't a pop song, it was a ballad, a 6-minute epic in the tradition of old sea chantés. It told the story with haunting simplicity, mixing fact with a touch of artistic license. It spoke of the gales of November, of the fateful trip, of the cook saying, "Fellas, it's been good to know you." The song became an unlikely hit. It climbed the charts around the world. Its mournful melody and evocative lyrics brought the tragedy into the living rooms of millions of people who had never seen a Great Lake, let alone an ore carrier. Lightfoot's song did something powerful. It froze the story in the cultural amber. It turned a complex industrial accident into a modern myth. It gave the event an emotional truth that transcended the dry facts of the investigation. For decades now, that song has been the primary way people know about the Fitzgerald. It has kept the memory alive, ensuring that the names of the ship and her crew are not forgotten. But myth has a way of simplifying things. The song focuses on the fury of the storm and the inevitability of fate. It doesn't talk about load lines or hatch clamp pressure or metal fatigue. It makes the disaster feel like a grand, tragic opera rather than a terrifying failure of engineering and human judgment under extreme duress. The song remembers the feelings, the awe, the sadness, the respect for the power of nature. It doesn't remember the mechanics. And so the Edmund Fitzgerald exists in two realities. There is the historical reality, the rusting steel on the bottom of Lake Superior, the subject of endless technical debate. And there is the mythical reality, the ghost ship of the song, forever battling the gales of November in the collective imagination. Meanwhile, the lake itself remains unchanged. Go to the shore of Lake Superior today, on a grey day in November. Stand on the beach at Whitefish Point and look out over the water. The lake doesn't care about our songs. It doesn't care about our investigations or our improved safety regulations. It is exactly the same body of water it was in 1975. It is just as deep, just as cold, and just as capable of horrific violence. Modern 1,000-foot ships still sail these waters. They have better radar, satellite weather forecasting, and enclosed survival crafts. They are safer machines. But every November the gales still come. The low-pressure systems still spin up over the plains, the winds still scream, and the waves still build into moving mountains of grey-green water. And every captain, no matter how big their ship or how advanced their technology, feels the same tightening in their stomach when they see that forecast. They know that out there in the dark, the lake is waiting. The Edmund Fitzgerald is a reminder. It is a monument to the limits of human ambition against the raw power of the natural world. We build our machines, we forge our steel, we write our schedules, we convince ourselves we have tamed the environment. And then, the environment shrugs, and our greatest creations are swatted aside like toys. The pattern continues. Ships sail, storms blow, most make it through, some don't. And 530 feet below the surface, in the eternal cold and dark, the wreckage of the Queen of the Lakes rests in the silent silt. If you could go down there, if you could stand on the slanted deck of the bow section and put your ear to the rusted steel of the pilot house, you wouldn't hear the wind, you wouldn't hear the waves, you wouldn't hear the screams of dying men, you would hear only the crushing silence of the deep lake, a silence that is the final immutable verdict on the grand ambition of the Edmund Fitzgerald. And if you listen hard enough, echoing through that silence, you might just hear the faint ghostly memory of a calm baritone voice speaking across the decades, saying the most terrifying words ever spoken on the water. We are holding our own. Some disasters don't end in screams. They end in quiet professionalism that lasts until the very last second. They end with men doing their jobs, trusting their machine, right up to the moment the world falls away. That is the legacy of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Not a curse, not a mystery, but a sobering testament to the price of hubris and the chilling dignity of men facing the end, without knowing it, has already arrived.